Today we're going to continue to look at interest groups and the role that interest groups play in the political process. So we've already started by talking about what an interest group is, how it differs from a political party, etc. Now we're going to take a look at two basic goals. Number one, we are going to explain the advantages and disadvantages, or criticisms really, of an interest group. And number two, we are going to explain the various different types of interest groups in the American political system. So, first of all, the advantages and the criticisms. One of the major advantages of an interest group is it's a way to get your voice heard. It's a way for people to participate in the political process, especially if you're under the age of 18 years old and you can't vote. One way that you can easily get involved in the political process is by joining an interest group. Just because you're not 18 doesn't mean that your voice won't be heard in politics. Another major advantage is it bases representation on your ideas and not on your geography. And so it doesn't really matter where in the country you live, interest groups will try to influence the political process. So you could live in Michigan and try to influence some type of policy that's being passed in California because you've got the same idea as the congressman or woman or whoever is involved in politics that's located in a different state or a different geographical area. Conversely, if we look at political parties often are based on geography. So for example, if you live in the city of Detroit and you've got conservative values, pretty much your voice is not going to get heard. Most of the politicians in Detroit, most of the citizens in Detroit always vote for Democrats, and so if you're a Republican, if you're conservative, your idea doesn't get heard. On the other hand, you can still support those candidates all across the country who do believe in the same ideas as you, not based on geography, but based on ideas. So you can join an interest group, and if you're conservative, maybe there's somebody in Texas, or maybe there's somebody in Florida, or maybe there's somebody in California who has the same ideals as you that we're not going to find in your own district. So that is a major advantage of an interest group. One of the major criticisms or one of the major disadvantages of an interest group is that they have a disproportionate amount of influence. And so when we look at that, interest groups often have a whole lot of money, particularly through political action committees or PACs. And because of this, that gets them a crazy amount of influence to senators, congressmen, the president, and other various politicians. They may not be a very large majority of the people, but they do have a whole lot of influence. Another thing that's difficult to tell, another criticism of an interest group is it's difficult to tell who is represented. So your interest group may have $1 billion, but may only have 100 members. But because they've got $1 billion, again, not only are they getting a disproportionate amount of influence, but it's also hard to tell who they're representing. Are they representing the will of all the American people, or are they just focused on those few people who have donated to their cause? And when you're a politician, sometimes it's kind of hard to figure that out. It's hard to tell whether an interest group has a lot of money because they've got a lot of supporters, or just because they're trying to buy support by using their money. Another major criticism of an interest group is they don't always represent the views of those that they claim to speak for. And what we mean by this is an interest group may say, well, we, on behalf of all Americans, believe that pollution is good for America. And clearly, they're not speaking on behalf of all Americans, but they claim to. And again, if you don't do a lot of research into who is making the claim, then it's sometimes hard to tell who an interest group is speaking for. Finally, in very rare cases, and this is not common, but it does happen, so I think it's worth mentioning, sometimes interest groups tend to bribe politicians. Sometimes they will threaten or blackmail or do other things that today we might view as being unethical. And as a result, that will also kind of gives interest groups a bad name. Now, to be fair, most interest groups aren't doing unethical things. Most interest groups are not bribing people. They're just trying to influence the process. But it is worth noting that there are some shady situations out there. If we take a look at this chart, it tells us the perceptions of the dominance of big interest. And what it's showing us is that most people believe that they don't really have a whole lot of say in politics and that they can't really influence politics. Well, the big interest groups, the interest groups with a lot of money, are really the ones influencing the political process. And maybe they're right. So if we look at the amount of money spent on lobbying in 2004, now numbers much larger today, but even in 2004, over $325 billion by the healthcare industry lobbying Congress. The communications industry, over $280 billion. The financial industry, $272 billion. And looking at these numbers, and as you go down the list, you might question when Congress makes a decision like the bank bailout, did they do it because they thought it was in the best interest of America as a whole? Or did they do it because they got $272 billion from the banking industry? Again, maybe it's a little bit of both, but certainly interest groups muddy the water. We're now going to look at the various types of interest groups. You won't need to know the specifics on each one, so if we go a little quick, don't worry too much about it. But I just want to give you an example of the various different types of interest groups out there and some of the interests that they represent. And so probably the biggest amount of interest groups out there are the interest groups that represent big business, that represent businesses. And some of the things that they're fighting for include environmental regulations. A lot of businesses want fewer environmental regulations because if you're going to save the environment, it costs money. If you can do things by polluting, usually it's a little bit cheaper to do things that way. Businesses also lobby Congress in favor of tax cuts or lowering or raising the interest rate if it's going to benefit their business. They focus on trade policy, especially with foreign countries, and they also focus on labor laws. So the fewer labor laws, the easier it is to do business, and so business interest groups try to influence the country, these as well as other ways, but these are some of the major ways. Labor union is usually a type of an interest group. The union itself is not an interest group, but most labor unions have political action committees where they'll put donations and money towards trying to influence the political process. And so some of the things that labor unions fight for: better wages for their workers, lower working hours, better pay for the hours that they are working, and also increasing jobs within America. So for example, especially with the automotive industry in this area, we're real big on how do we create jobs in Michigan and how do we stop jobs from going overseas. I think it's worth noting that labor unions are on the decline. We know that from U.S. history that labor unions sort of reached their peak in the 1930s and 40s, and by the 1950s they start to decline downward. And especially with today, a lot of people think that they don't really need unions. They take for granted the influence that the unions have had on the history of the United States, and we just kind of have these rights today and we don't recognize where they come from. So in some cases, unions are maybe downplayed in the current world, but that's a trend that we're following. Most professional businesses, most professional organizations have what we would call a professional organization, and they are there to represent the interest of their profession. So for example, teachers have the Michigan Education Association or the American Education Association that will lobby for the rights of teachers and students within schools. Lawyers have the American Bar Association, doctors have the American Medical Association, and pretty much every other professional job that you can think of will probably have some type of organization that will represent their needs and their interests to Congress, the president, and politicians as a whole. There are some agricultural groups out there. We don't think of these as being a big deal around Michigan, but if you lived on the west side of the state, or especially if you live in places like Iowa or Indiana, where farming is a huge percentage of your income for your state, agriculture becomes pretty important. So there are groups that lobby Congress for crop subsidies. There are groups that want more loans for farmers so that they can upgrade their equipment. And of course, just like every other business here in America, farmers don't want foreign competition. So as much as they can try to get you to buy American, that is another goal of agricultural groups. Most races and ethnicities also have a group to represent them. There are a lot of civil rights groups sometimes, as they're called. So these are groups that are fighting to end discrimination and to create more equality within the United States of America. They're fighting for minority rights, and sometimes that means African Americans, sometimes the minority is Cuban Americans, sometimes women, in even certain circumstances, sometimes white men could be the minority in a group. And so racial and ethnic groups generally are fighting for equality and fighting for more political representation among their members. Probably the most common one, and the one you're most familiar with, is the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, fighting for African American rights. But certainly there are other civil rights organizations out there. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, is another big one. Then there are a number of religious groups out there, and so there are groups that are pro-abortion, there are groups that are anti-abortion, there are groups that are pro-gay marriage, there are groups that are anti-gay marriage, pro-prayer in school, anti-prayer in public schools, and you name the number of religious issues, there are usually groups to support them. But prayer in public schools, homosexuality, and abortion tend to be the biggest issues that are represented by interest groups out there. And again, they would lobby Congress in favor of laws supporting whatever their position may be. There are citizens, advocacy groups, and causes. So sometimes we have issue-based interest groups. So things like the Sierra Club wants to protect the environment. Greenpeace strives to protect the environment. The NRA, the National Rifle Association, wants to protect your rights to own a gun. And so if you go issue by issue among almost every major issue you can think of, there is probably an interest group or an advocacy group to support your ideas and your opinions. We want to take a look at some of the interest groups and how much money they spend. For example, it's broken down into topics, economic groups, public interest, we've got environmental groups, good government groups, etc. You can take a look at this list on your own. It's posted to Moodle, or you can just pause this right now. So for example, the FLCIO is a single issue interest group. They've got over 13 million members. They've got a political action committee, and on average, they donated about $512,000 per campaign. And so that's a ton of money that's being donated throughout the course of a campaign. Well, with that said, that brings our discussion of interest groups to an end. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you soon. Have a wonderful day.